Hi everyone, I'm Miranda and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm chatting about my favourite short story collections. I'm actually a big fan of short stories. I always have a collection of them on my bedside table, and I thought it would be fun to share some of my favourites with you today. I also think that autumn and winter are the perfect seasons to get into short stories. They're great times of year to curl up in bed with a collection, or maybe even to get cozy around the fire and read a short story aloud. So I hope you enjoy my recommendations. First up, I think what really first got me into short stories was, of course, enjoying fairy tales as a child. And this was one of my very favourite collections. It's Old Peter's Russian Tales by Arthur Ransom. And this is a collection of folklore and fairy stories that I was absolutely fascinated by as a young girl. There's one story in here. It's called The Tale of the Silver Saucer and the Transparent Apple. And that's not such a well-known story, but I absolutely loved it. It's got quite a few gruesome bits in it, but you know what children are like when it comes to these old fairy tales. And certainly some of them are a bit gruesome, but as always, the good end happily and the bad unhappily. And I had a lot of satisfaction out of that as a child. But this is a really interesting collection of tales, and Arthur Ransom, of course, was well known for the Swallows and Amazon books, but he spent some time in Russia and he wrote down some of these stories. So this is one I still return to, and it's quite a good one if you want a bit more unusual fairy tales. Then I've got three short story anthologies that I turn to a lot. These are some of my very favourite anthologies, and it's a collection of three titles: Love, Loss, and Life. And it's a collection of short stories around each of these three themes. I think my very favourite one is Love, but they're all really good, and Victoria Hislop, who is the editor and who's chosen all of the stories, she's chosen ones from all around the world. She's chosen modern writers as well as writers who are no longer alive, and they're really fascinating collections. They're all written by women, and these are ones I just love to return to. Here it says love is represented here in all its guises: romantic, maternal, happy, or haunting. And it's a great selection of authors, from classic short story writers like Catherine Mansfield through to Jeanette Winterson, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Emma Donoghue. Lots and lots of brilliant writers are represented in all three of these. And if you're not really sure where to start with short stories and you're just intrigued and want to try out a few, then I would really recommend looking at these. Like I said, my favourite is Love, and I also like Loss a lot. Sometimes she uses the theme in a very interesting way. So stories in this cover all different kinds of loss, from very big losses that cause a lot of grief to much smaller losses. And I really like how she does that. And then, of course, Life is a really excellent one too. So I really recommend these anthologies if you're not sure where to begin with the short story. I think this gives you a lot of variety of writers, and it will help you to develop your own taste and maybe become aware of some very good writers of short stories who you'd like to explore a bit more. Then another favourite anthology of mine, it's such a beautiful book, which is definitely partly why I love it so much. This is The Golden Age of British Short Stories from 1890 to 1914. It's edited by Philip Hensher. So this is a collection of stories mainly from Edwardian times, and it features a lot of classic writers. So Henry James, for instance, is in here. Oscar Wilde, I think he was an amazing short story writer, actually. Thomas Hardy, Rudyard Kipling, E.M. Forster, E.F. Benson, lots of great writers represented in here, and I think it's just a really stunning book. So I do love having this one on my shelf, and it's also the type of book that's really nice to put on the bedside table if you're having visitors. I think I always like thinking about what books to put out for any guests, and a really gorgeous short story anthology like this I think is always such a great choice. So I really love this one. One of my favourite publishers of short stories is actually Persephone Books, and I think discovering Persephone Books in my very early 20s is partly what inspired a real love for short stories as an adult reader. They are, of course, very well known for books they've rediscovered by and about women, mainly books from the early 20th century or the first half of the 20th century. But something that's very special, I think, about Persephone Books is they republish a lot of short story collections. And it was through reading some of these that I grew to love short stories myself even more. So a great starting place is with the Persephone Book of Short Stories. There's also a second volume of this, and this is just a really well thought out and well put together selection of short stories from many different women writers. Some real favourites of mine like E.M. Delafield and Edith Wharton, Catherine Mansfield, and Sylvia Townsend Warner. This is a really great introduction to the Persephone style of short story, and I definitely recommend this volume. And then, speaking of Sylvia Townsend Warner, quite recently Persephone Books published English Climate Wartime Stories, and this is a selection of short stories that Sylvia Townsend Warner wrote mainly for the New Yorker, and they were published during the Second World War. I read this fairly recently and I absolutely loved it. It was such an interesting, varied collection of stories from her. Many of them have still really stuck with me. And although they don't tend to follow very dramatic incidents, although there is one very memorable story where a bomb drops and people end up having to take cover in an open grave. That is definitely memorable. But a lot of these stories cover more sort of quiet domestic scenes, although there's always a tinge of unease to all of her stories, and some of her own beliefs come through in her writing as well. Sylvia Townsend Warner was a communist, and some of that comes out, even though quite subtly, in these stories, and I found that very interesting too. A lot of the Persephone short story collections are concerned with the Second World War, and one of the most famous examples of this is Good Evening, Mrs. Craven, the wartime stories of Molly Panther Downs. These are amazing short stories. Again, they're set during the Second World War, and again they cover very domestic scenes generally, but they give such a fascinating insight into the lives of ordinary women during the Second World War, and I highly recommend this book. This is the classic edition with the pictorial cover, which I really love, but it's also available in the grey edition too. And then, of course, if you're a fan of Persephone books, you've probably read at least one of the novels of Dorothy Whipple. This selection of her short stories I think is really brilliant. It's Closed Door and Other Stories. I think Dorothy Whipple was a great short story writer, and I really recommend this volume. Then a real favourite of mine is Catherine Mansfield, and this collection, the Montana stories by her, I think are really brilliant. I'm trying to remember the name of one of my very favourites. a cup of tea. That's probably quite predictable, actually. But A Cup of Tea is one of my very favourite short stories. It's about a woman who is shopping and she suddenly meets a very poor young woman and she invites her back to her house, supposedly to give her aid, but her motives are really quite selfish. And when she realizes that her husband has definitely noticed this young woman, her feelings of generosity undergo a sudden change, and the ending really leaves you feeling quite uneasy. So that is definitely one of my favorites. And of course, The Garden Party is one of her most famous short stories, and it is very memorable too. So there are lots of stories in here though that I love and that definitely stay with you long after finishing them. Then, if you're a fan of Persephone books as well, I've pulled together a few that I think you might like to try. This is an excellent collection of short stories, again about World War II, that was fairly recently republished by Virago, and it's called Wave Me Goodbye, Stories of the Second World War, edited by Anne Boston. So I know that a lot of Persephone readers like me are very interested in literature from the Second World War, and I think this would be a great short story anthology to add to your collection. Then I am a really big fan of Miss Read, and this was a book I mentioned was on my September reading list. It's Tales from a Village School by Miss Read, and I have indeed been reading some of the stories. This has been on my bedside table, and they've just been lovely, cozy reads to enjoy before I go to bed. I wanted to recommend one in particular. It's School Dinner for 40. That one really had me chuckling to myself because it's just told in such a witty way, and it's mainly, I think, all told in dialogue, this short story. And it's the sort of monologue of a primary school teacher during the school dinner time trying to get these children to eat their vegetables and rather unappetizing looking swede, and that brought back a lot of memories for me, and I just found it hilarious. I love Miss Read's quiet humour, and it really shows in that short story. But there are a lot of charming ones in this collection. I don't think it's still in print, unfortunately, but there are a lot of secondhand copies available. So if you're a fan of Miss Read too, or you'd like a bit of gentle humour, then I definitely recommend searching this one out. And then I absolutely adore the writer Elizabeth Taylor. Again, if you're a fan of Persephone books, you'll most likely have come across Elizabeth Taylor's novels, but her short stories are less known, and I think they're amazing. They remind me a lot of Catherine Mansfield, so if you're a fan of her, then I really recommend trying Elizabeth Taylor's short stories. This is the complete collection of her short stories, and I think it's just a brilliant read, so it's definitely one that I recommend. And then again, if you like Persephone books, I would really highly recommend looking up the short story collection of Elizabeth Bowen. There's one that was just new out. There's a lovely hardback. I'll put a picture of it here because I don't have it myself, but it's on my wish list. And it's the selected stories of Elizabeth Bowen, and it was just recently brought out, and I really want to get it because I think she was also a great short story writer. So one on my list and one to look out for if you're a fan of Persephone books. I think you would probably enjoy those stories too. I'm sorry if you can hear some loud buzzing. There's a giant bumblebee that's just somehow got into the room, and I've tried to get it out, but it's really high up on a window and I can't reach it right now. So I'm going to have to try and deal with that later, but sorry if you can hear a bumblebee in the background. That's what this is. But anyway, continuing with my short stories, as you've probably gathered, and certainly if you're already familiar with my channel, you will know that I mainly read backlisted and vintage books, but I did want to share some modern short story collections that I've read over the past few years and that really stayed with me. So the first one is You Think It, I'll Say It by Curtis Sittenfeld. I only have a Kindle edition of this, so I'll put a picture up here for you. This has been described as the good, the bad and the ugly of women's lives. And all of these short stories are about a woman and generally her relationships. And what I enjoyed about these is there's often a bit of a sort of twist at the end of the story, and I really like it when an author does that, especially with a short story. So I would really recommend these, maybe especially to if you're not so familiar with the short story genre and you're just getting into it, because in general I just found these quite light and very easy to read. So I think they might be a good starting place. Then another short story collection by a modern writer that I really enjoyed reading a few years ago is How to Love a Jamaican by Alexia Arthurs. This was actually a debut book, which really astonished me at the time because the writing in it is just so confident, it's so assured. Alexia Arthurs had already won, I think, what prize was it? She'd won the Paris Review's Plimpton Prize for one of the short stories, Bad Behaviour, that's in here. And that really doesn't surprise me because I think there's just so much skill already to her way of structuring a short story that really comes over in this collection. These are all stories about Jamaican immigrants and their family back at home. So the stories go from being set in New York City to a Midwestern university and Jamaica itself. And the way that these stories sort of interconnect and almost bounce off each other through the volume, I found really, really interesting. It's very well put together. So definitely one I would recommend. And then a bit of a different one, but I did want to highlight Cream Buns and Crime, Tips, Tricks and Tales from the Detective Society by Robin Stevens. I really love the children's books, the Murder Most Unladylike series by Robin Stevens, and something that I think is great about what she's done with these series is she's written a lot of short stories around the main books for children too. And I love that because I love that she's encouraging young readers to read different types of stories and to enjoy short stories and to maybe inspire them to write short stories themselves. I think that that's really great, and I do admire a writer for children who is doing that and who is really making the short story part of her genre. I love reading these books as an adult. I think the Murder Most Unladylike detective stories are lots of fun. They're set in the 1930s in a British boarding school, and it's about two young girls from quite different backgrounds but who end up being best friends, and they form a detective society together and they solve all sorts of crimes. It's like Enid Blyton mixed with Hercule Poirot, and it's really just a lot of fun. Okay. Of course, a lot of short stories are perfect for spooky season as we start to get ready for that. And I thought I would share some of my favourite disturbing, slightly chilling short story collections with you. So first up is a real classic, Don't Look Now by Daphne du Maurier. I read Don't Look Now years and years ago when I was probably about 20, and I was about to go to Venice because this short story is set in Venice, and it was utterly terrifying. Daphne du Maurier is of course wonderful at writing about the sinister, and she just builds atmosphere so well. So that's a short story I've never forgotten, and I highly recommend reading it if you haven't already. Then, if you like Daphne du Maurier, I would recommend the short stories of Roald Dahl. One collection I particularly remember is called Kiss Kiss. Again, I only have a Kindle version, so I'll put it up here. But his stories are very sinister. They really look at the dark side of human nature. They can be quite grotesque or a bit macabre. And I just think that they're really great choices if you want to give yourself a bit of a chill, or yes, choose a bit of a spooky, scary read as we come up to Halloween in October. Then I definitely recommend those. Then another favourite collection of mine is Sleep No More, 6 Murderous Tales by P.D. James, and I adore the autumnal cover on this one. I think it's gorgeous. My favourite short story in this is called Mr. Millcroft's Birthday. It's the very last one, and I just kind of loved the twist to it. I thought it was really brilliantly done, so I highly recommend that last story in particular. There's also a more Christmas related short story in this, but there are also ones that aren't Christmassy at all, so you can just skip that Christmas one if you don't want to read it yet. The others are just good for sort of autumnal reading, so those are great. I think my very favourite ghost story, short story collection is this one, Classic Ghost Stories, and it was published by Vintage Classics. I love the cover by Ed Clues, and this is a lot of classic Victorian and Edwardian writers. The first one in it is by Charles Dickens. It's called The Signalman, and I found that one the scariest. That one was quite terrifying. I mean, I am a bit wimpy, so, you know, other people wouldn't find it scary. I found that one the scariest though. It was really chilling, but it was so good. It makes you realise what a great dramatic writer Dickens was in the short story form as well, not just his much longer works, but he really knew how to keep an audience on edge. So yeah, there are lots of great stories in this, real sort of classic Victorian spooky ones that I recommend. This is a more recent short story collection that I discovered because I've been really getting into the writing of Elizabeth Jane Howard. I love her Catholic Chronicles, but I've been reading more of her other books, and this is her short story collection. I also heard a BBC dramatisation of the title short story, Mr. Wrong, and that is one of the creepiest stories I have ever read, and hearing it dramatised was really scary too. It just leaves like chills down your spine. It's a short story about a murderer and about a young girl who's haunted by his crime, and it's utterly chilling, and the ending is quite horrible. I mean, it's not for the faint-hearted, I have to say, that short story, but it really is spooky and it definitely keeps you reading. So yes, a lot of these stories have a bit of a darker twist to them, but they certainly all keep you guessing and entertained, and yeah, I've been enjoying that. Then this is another short story collection that I always like to get out around Halloween time. That's Udibranch by Irenison Okoje. I remember interviewing Irenison about this short story collection a few years ago. We met up on a very cold December day and we sat at the top of the London Library and we talked about crafting short stories and about this book in particular, and it was so much fun. And I just always want to pull this one out when the weather starts getting cold. There are some stories in here that are really brilliant for spooky season. Let me tell you which I particularly recommend. So There's one that is called Grace Jones, and that is a great read in the run-up to Halloween. And then Point and Trill is also quite terrifying. Two of the characters become almost like werewolf-like beings in it, and it's really quite terrifying. But I think Irenison Okoje is just such an original writer. There's so much originality to her, and she's a great writer of short stories. So yes, this is one I really recommend pulling out in the autumn, and especially in the run-up to Halloween. And then a slightly more cozy choice, but still mysterious, are the Miss Marple short stories by Agatha Christie. I love this Folio Society edition of the complete Miss Marple short stories. These are such favourites of mine. I have them as an audio book as well, and I've recently started knitting myself a scarf, you know, feeling very cozy and autumnal. And whilst I was knitting, I was listening to Joan Hickson reading the Miss Marple short stories, and honestly I don't think it gets much cozier than that. So yeah, I really love the Miss Marple stories. I think they're lots of fun, and the whole idea of them is a group of friends, including Miss Marple, gather round the fire and they tell each other unsolved mysteries that they themselves happen to know the answer to, but the real solution to the mystery isn't generally known, and everyone else in the group has to guess what they think the solution to the problem is. And of course it's only Miss Marple who always gets it right. And yeah, I just love them. They're so much fun. If you enjoy that type of cozy murder mystery, then another one you might like is Murder at the Manor, Country House Mysteries, edited by Martin Edwards. This is part of the British Library Crime Classics, and it says the English country house is an iconic setting for some of the greatest British crime fiction. This new collection gathers together stories written over a span of about 65 years, during which British society and life in country houses was transformed out of all recognition. And there are some real kind of undiscovered classics, as well as a bit more well-known writers and stories that are gathered together in this collection. But yes, if you're a fan of Agatha Christie, Miss Marple, then I think this would be a fun one to try as well. Then of course a real classic, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, and I adore this edition. If I can find it, I will link it in the description box down below. It was published by Rockport, and there are just some really amazing illustrations in this. I really love it, and I love being transported back to the world of 221B Baker Street, going around Victorian London with Holmes and Watson. It's just so much fun. So this is a real classic short story collection for me and for many others. If you are also a fan of Sherlock Holmes, you may want to try The Tea House Detective by Baroness Orszézy. Not quite sure how you say the last name, but I think she was a Hungarian writer. And these stories were really written kind of directly in response to the Sherlock Holmes stories. They came out in about 1905, I think. The sort of first ones, they appeared in magazines. And the idea is that the tea house detective is able, this sort of mysterious character is able to solve crimes without leaving the tea house. He just sort of sits in a chair and comes up with the solution. So yeah, if you like Sherlock Holmes, you might want to give these a try. And then finally, I do of course love short stories that not only make me feel a bit spooky, but that also make me laugh. I love the P.G. Woodhouse short stories, especially his golf short stories, funnily enough, because I don't play golf, I know nothing about it, but his short stories about golf, only they're not really about golf. They're all about sort of love triangles and all that sort of thing, but they're often set on a golf course or the golf club. And I think they're amongst some of P.G. Woodhouse's funniest short stories, so I really love those. I own these really as audiobooks, so I don't have the physical copies, but I also love the Mr. Mulliner short stories by P.G. Woodhouse. Those are real favourites of mine too, and they always make me laugh. And then there's the Rumple books by John Mortimer. And a bit like P.G. Woodhouse, each sort of story is really like its own, each chapter is really its own short story in the Rumple books for the most part, and they're just so funny. I mean, obviously all of these are books of their time, but the Rumple ones I've listened to for years and years and years, and they always make me laugh. They're about a rather grumpy barrister who always fights for the underdog, and his sort of run-ins with judges and his wife Hilda are always really very witty and funny. So I've been having this one by my bedside table. As you can see, I've read quite a bit of this already, and this is one that I will reread fairly regularly. But anyway, those are quite a few of my favourite short story collections. I hope you've enjoyed listening to my recommendations. Sorry about the buzzing. I have to track down that bee now and see if I can get it out the door, so wish me luck. And also let me know if you're a fan of short stories, or if you want to start giving short stories a go. I'd be really interested in hearing if this is a favourite genre of yours or not. But do give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and I'll be back again very soon with another video. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.